Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. This Saturday is UFC 283 Brazil, and the featured fight on the main card is Gilbert Burns versus Neil Magny, and this is going to be my full breakdown and prediction. I've already done predictions for the main event and co-main event, Glover Teixeira versus Jamahal Hill for the light heavyweight title, as well as Devison Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno 4 for the flyweight title. I will link both those videos down in the description, as well as my UFC 283 playlist. I have a bunch of videos covering UFC 283, and I have more coming, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of those videos. So when I look at this matchup between Gilbert Burns and Neil Magny, it's not a fight that I'm particularly hyped for, to be honest, because I would almost rather see Gilbert Burns fight anyone else. You know, we got kind of teased with the Jorge Masvidal matchup, but Jorge Masvidal's too busy pretending he's a politician at this point in time. And then I would have rather seen Gilbert Burns against Colby Covington, Bilal Muhammad, Shavkat Rakhmonov. You know, there's a litany of names that I would have preferred to see Gilbert Burns take on, and he ends up kind of with Neil Magny. And this fight, I feel like, is kind of a mismatch on paper. I do think Neil Magny has a chance in this fight. We're going to get to that in a minute. But this is a matchup that's important for Gilbert Burns. It's very important for Neil Magny. But it's just one of those fights that kind of just doesn't make sense. You know, I always compliment the UFC when I feel like they have excellent matchmaking. And I feel like this fight is kind of weird. But it's very important for both guys nonetheless, because Neil Magny's kind of been a guy that's been hanging around as like a gatekeeper for the top 10 for the last few years. And now he's got a massive fight on his hands with number 5 ranked Gilbert Burns. If he can go out there and get a win over Gilbert Burns, Neil Magny is in contender discussion. That's insane. That's something I thought I would never say. And for Gilbert Burns, he's ranked pretty high right now. You know, even though he's coming off a loss, a lot of people aren't burying him for it because he just lost to Khamzat Chimaev, who a lot of people believe is the future of the welterweight division if he can make weight. And if Gilbert Burns loses to Neil Magny, imagine if Neil Magny stops Gilbert Burns. Gilbert Burns' UFC career, I mean, that would be an absolute catastrophe for his career. He's going to find himself ranked outside of the top 10 if he drops a fight against Neil Magny at UFC 283. So this means a lot for both guys, but I still think it's a little bit of weird matchmaking. Now, if you look at the tail of the tape for this fight, Gilbert Burns is ranked number 5. Neil Magny is ranked number 12. You have Gilbert Burns, who is 20-5. Neil Magny is 27-9. Burns is 36. Magny is 35. Burns is 5'10", Magny is 6'3". Burns has a 71-inch reach, and Magny has an 80-inch reach. So a massive 9-inch reach advantage for Magny and a 5-inch height advantage for Neil Magny. Now you look at Neil Magny, of his 27 wins, he has 7 wins by knockout, 4 by submission, 16 by decision. Of his 9 losses, 2 by knockout, 5 by submission, and 2 by decision. And Neil Magny's a guy that's just been hanging around in the welterweight division forever. He made his UFC debut on the same card that Ronda Rousey made her UFC debut all the way back in February of 2013. That is insane to me. He's been around forever, and you know, he's been able to string some wins together, but it seems like every time he gets a step up in competition, he ends up losing the fight. His last fight was against Daniel Rodriguez. He won that fight via Darce choke. Basically out-grappled him. Daniel Rodriguez started to get tired in the 3rd round, eventually catches him in a Darce choke. But you look out throughout the course of Neil Magny's career, he'll string 3 or 4 wins together, and then he loses to Damian Maia. He strings another 3 wins together, loses to Lorenz Larkin. And I know some of you guys may not know who Lorenz Larkin is. He came over from Strikeforce. He was a very good fighter. I think he might be in Bellator now. He might have been retired by now. But nonetheless, another step up in competition, Neil Magny loses. He has a win over Johnny Hendricks, but that's on the downslope of Johnny Hendricks' career. Has a loss to Rafael Dos Anjos, has a loss to Santiago Ponzinibbio, has a loss to Michael Chiesa. It just seems like every time he gets that step up in the welterweight division, he ends up losing. His last loss was actually kind of a test for that guy, so I think Neil Magny might have been ranked ahead of him. But nonetheless, I feel like it's still on paper, it was a step up in competition for Magny. Was against Shavkat Rakhmonov back in June of last year. And, you know, a lot of people favored Shavkat going in this fight. He's the dark horse of the welterweight division. And Shavkat went out there and dominated him. Took him down in the 1st round, controlled him on the ground, gets him down in the 2nd round, eventually gets a guillotine in the 2nd round. Absolutely dominated Neil Magny. And Neil Magny is a guy that's super well-rounded. And when he's not fighting a guy that's an elite level grappler, most of the time he can out grapple that guy. But if he ends up fighting a guy, an elite level grappler like Shavkat Rakhmonov, he typically will end up getting out grappled. The best win, I would say, on Neil Magny's resume is probably Jeff Neal back in May of 2021. Jeff Neal has had a career resurgence. Jeff Neal, I think, is ranked like number 6 or number 7 currently in the UFC official rankings. That was a quality win over Jeff Neal. Jeff Neal, he's fighting Shavkat Rakhmonov, I think, at UFC 285. Jeff Neal could be a title contender in a matter of 2 months. But that was 2 years ago. Jeff Neal kind of had that long layoff and had that issue where he was in the hospital. I can't remember exactly what was going on. But that's his best win on his resume, and he's just always really like trading wins and losses. He'll kind of, you win a couple, then lose one. Win a couple, lose one. And doesn't have, you look through his resume, doesn't have, every win that sticks out is kind of like somebody on the downslope of their career. Robbie Lawler, Johnny Hendricks, Carlos Condit. The names go on and on. So it's not the greatest of resumes, but he's been a guy that's been able to hang around in the welterweight division for a long time. You look at Gilbert Burns, of his 20 wins, 6 by knockout, 8 by submission, 6 by decision. Of his 5 losses, 2 by knockout and 3 by decision. His last fight was against Khamzat Chimaev back in April of 2022 at UFC 273. One of the best fights of 2022. First round was crazy. First round was crazy and it was clearly Khamzat Chimaev's. Second round was crazy. It was clearly Gilbert Burns. And then the third round, I thought it was Khamzat Chimaev's, but I wouldn't call you delusional if you scored it for Gilbert Burns. And a lot of people believe that Khamzat Chimaev, if he can continue to make weight, because we know what happened at UFC 279, there's a lot of people that believe Khamzat Chimaev is the future of the welterweight division. And that was a very competitive fight there. And I would love to see that fight rebooked for 5 rounds at some point in time. And shout out to Gilbert Burns. Nobody wanted that Khamzat Chimaev fight outside of Neil Magny, actually. Gilbert Burns takes it. He ends up losing. And, now he's here fighting Neil Magny. But still, I don't think, even with a loss against Khamzat, who was outside the rankings at the time, or, outside the top 10, I think, at the time, I still don't think it hurt Gilbert Burns' stock at all, the way the fight played out. The fight before that, Gilbert Burns dominated Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, just out-grappled him. This was back at UFC 264, July of 2021. So Gilbert Burns not being super active. And I know people nitpick the Stephen Wonderboy Thompson win, because since then, basically after getting out-grappled by Bilal Muhammad and Gilbert Burns, Wonderboy Thompson won't fight anyone if you wrestled in elementary school. So there is kind of that, but Wonderboy kind of had a resurgence with the win over Kevin Holland, even though I don't think Kevin Holland belongs in the rankings at welterweight. But still, at the time, it was a quality win. A lot of people thought Wonderboy Thompson had a chance in that fight. Before that was his title shot against Kamaru Usman back at UFC 258. What an ugly pay-per-view card that was. I just remember that off the top of my head. That was a terrible pay-per-view card. But nonetheless, he goes out there, almost finishes Kamaru Usman in the first round. Unfortunately for Gilbert Burns, he doesn't get the finish, and eventually he gets finished in the third round by Kamaru Usman. The fight before that is a win over Tyron Woodley. And I know people, I was looking over Gilbert Burns' resume, and I know people can pick this apart, but at the time, he took that fight on short notice against Tyron Woodley. It was originally supposed to be Woodley versus Edwards, and this was one fight removed from Woodley losing his title to Kamaru Usman, and Gilbert Burns went out there and dominated him on the feet, dominated him in the grappling, and just put the pace on Tyron Woodley. It was a phenomenal performance, especially considering this was when the world was going crazy and Gilbert Burns took it on short notice. The fight before that, he TKO'd Damian Maia. This was another short notice win. I think the Gunnar Nelson, the fight before that, was short notice. Gilbert Burns made his name basically on taking short notice fights against tough guys and pulling out the victory. Even the Kamaru Usman fight, or actually I'm wrong, after the Tyron Woodley fight, back in May of 2020, he was supposed to fight Kamaru Usman in July of 2020, but unfortunately he had to pull out of that fight, got sick. Jorge Masvidal stepped in, got 50-45, and then eventually Gilbert Burns got his title fight at UFC 258, February 2021. Because I was going to say, even, when he got his title shot, it was kind of short notice, but then I remember I mixed it up. It was really Jorge Masvidal, and it wasn't really that short of notice. I think it was a month's notice, and Jorge Masvidal was preparing for that fight anyway. But nonetheless, Gilbert Burns, you could pick apart his resume and say his best wins are Wonderboy Thompson and Tyron Woodley. What does that really mean? But at that point in time, at that moment in history, those were solid wins by Gilbert Burns. So when I look at both these fighters and I try to compare them to each other, I think Gilbert Burns, I really think this is kind of a mismatch for Neil Magny. I do think that Neil Magny is a super well-rounded fighter, and his massive height and reach advantage in this fight could do him well. Also, you have the fact that Gilbert Burns is a little bit chinny. You know, he's gotten dropped by jabs. He got dropped by a jab from Khamzat Chimaev. He got dropped by a jab from Kamaru Usman. And he's just appeared to be a little bit chinny. And I think Neil Magny could catch him. But Neil Magny doesn't have like crazy nuclear power. Of his 27 wins, only 7 by KO. And I don't remember the last time he KO'd someone. Craig White back in 2018. I don't even know who that is anymore. So that's his last win. I don't think Neil Magny can go out there and KO Gilbert Burns. So I think if Neil Magny's going to win this fight, I think he's going to have to win via decision because he's not submitting Gilbert Burns. It's just not happening. And Neil Magny's a guy who's super well-rounded. A lot of the time he implements grappling. He did it in the Daniel Rodriguez fight. He did it in the Jeff Neal fight. He did it in the Robbie Lawler fight. But Neil Magny's a very good grappler, but just up until a point where he goes against elite level grapplers. And when he goes against elite level grapplers, he ends up getting out grappled. And I think Gilbert Burns is a much superior grappler than Neil Magny. And I think with the reach and height disadvantage for Gilbert Burns, I think he will implement the grappling early and often. My official prediction for this fight, I am going Gilbert Burns via second round rear naked choke. I think he's going to win towards the tail end, maybe the last 2 minutes of the second round. I just think Gilbert Burns' wrestling and jiu-jitsu and submission skills are going to be too much for Neil Magny. Neil Magny has lost via submission 5 times in his pro MMA career, and I think Gilbert Burns is such a good submission artist, even though he hasn't really found it too much in the UFC against the elite level competition. I think Neil Magny is enough of a step down where Gilbert Burns will be able to go out there, out-wrestle him in the first round. I think he'll put Neil Magny in some danger. You'll probably hear Joe Rogan say he's in real trouble here, probably like 3 or 4 times within the first round. And I think Neil Magny will be just good enough to survive that first round, eke out that first round on bottom, lose it 10-9. And then I think in the second round, it's going to be more of the same. Gilbert Burns is going to find the takedown, just looking for transitions, looking for dominant positions, soften him up with some ground and pound, and eventually get the back and get the rear naked choke on Neil Magny towards the tail end of the second round. I think this is a mismatch. Gilbert Burns has better power. I think they both have similar stamina. It's just one of those fights where Gilbert Burns, I consider him in the category of elite level welterweights, and Neil Magny's like a gatekeeper for the top 10. So I think Gilbert Burns is going to win this fight. I think it's going to be a pretty dominant performance, and I think he finishes Neil Magny and his hairline in the second round, and I think he does it pretty impressively. As impressively as you can beat Neil Magny. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.